The suffocating silence, the air inside the arena had grown stale, heavy with the sweat of 40,000 people and the lingering exhaustion of a 3-hour broadcast that felt like it had no direction. It was late in 2026, and the landscape of the company had shifted into a polished, almost sterile era of production where surprises felt calculated and chaos felt rehearsed. The main event had just concluded in a way that left the audience restless, a controversial finish that didn't spark anger so much as it sparked apathy. The crowd wasn't booing with venom. They were checking their phones. The low hum of indifferent conversation, creating a white noise that was more damaging than silence. The ring crew began to dismantle the apron skirts, and the copyright graphic appeared in the bottom corner of the screens, signaling the end of the broadcast. Security began to relax their posture near the barricades, and the commentary team removed their headsets, rubbing their temples in anticipation of the flight home. There was no electricity, no buzzing anticipation, just the mundane reality of a show ending with a whimper. Then, the feed didn't cut. The copyright logo flickered and dissolved into a jarring high-frequency static that wasn't part of the standard production package. It wasn't the slick, produced glitch of a new faction debut. It was an ugly, audio-tearing screech that made people in the front row cover their ears. The house lights didn't drop to a dramatic blackout. Instead, they dimmed to a sickly, hospital yellow hue, casting long, uncomfortable shadows across the canvas. The giant LED screens wrapping the arena went black, not simply turned off, but void of signal. The murmuring crowd stopped, confusion rippling from the floor seats up to the rafters. It wasn't the excitement of a return. It was the unease of a technical failure. Security guards looked at each other, hands moving to their earpieces, trying to get instructions that weren't coming. Inside the ring, the referee who had been raising the victor's hand froze, looking toward the entrance ramp with genuine perplexity. The silence that followed the static was absolute, a vacuum where the only sound was the hum of the ventilation and the nervous shifting of 40,000 bodies, realizing that the show was not over, but something had gone wrong with the script. The ghost in the machine. From the darkness of the entrance tunnel, there was no pyrotechnic explosion, no rhythmic drumbeat, and absolutely no melody. There was only the sound of boots dragging slightly against the steel ramp, amplified by a hot microphone that shouldn't have been live. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the dim yellow wash of the emergency lighting. The walk was unrecognizable at first, lacking the fluid aerial grace that had once defined the division's high-flying spectacles. This gait was grounded, heavy, and predatory. As the figure stepped into the limited light, the realization hit the audience in staggered waves, starting with a few isolated gasps near the ramp and spreading like a contagion of disbelief. It was Iyo Sky. But it wasn't the polished superstar who had vanished from television nearly 2 years prior, without a retirement speech or a press release. This was a version stripped of the glitz, wearing nondescript combat-ready gear that looked more like survival equipment than a costume. Her hair was unkempt, framing a face that bore no expression, no smile, no snarl, just a hollow 1,000-yard stare that pierced through the camera lens. The commentary team, caught putting their headsets back on in a panic, didn't scream her name. There was no manufactured catchphrase or rehearsed excitement. One commentator simply whispered, his voice cracking with genuine confusion, asking if this was scheduled. The lack of music made the moment unbearably intimate and voyeuristic. You could hear the squeak of the leather, the intake of breath from the fans pressed against the railing. They didn't reach out to touch her. They recoiled, sensing a volatility that felt unsafe. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the hard camera. Her eyes were locked on the ring with a singularity of purpose that was terrifying. This wasn't a return for glory. It felt like an intrusion. The atmosphere in the arena shifted from confusion to a primal tension, the kind you feel before a street fight breaks out. It wasn't the joy of seeing a favorite wrestler. It was the chilling recognition that someone had walked into the building who no longer played by the rules of sports entertainment. The genius of the Sky had returned, but she had brought a storm with her that nobody had forecast. Violence without context, Iyo slid under the bottom rope, her movement efficient and devoid of fanfare. The wrestler currently standing in the ring, the champion who had been celebrating moments ago, backed into the corner, her championship belt lowering to their side as instinct overrode character. The referee stepped forward to intervene, to assert control over a segment that wasn't on his run sheet, but Iyo didn't even acknowledge his presence. She simply walked through him, the collision sending the official stumbling back, further blurring the lines of reality. There was no bell. There was no stare-down. Iyo launched herself at the champion with a velocity that defied the lethargy of the room. It wasn't a wrestling move. It was a tackle, raw and uncoordinated, followed by a flurry of strikes that looked less like choreographed punches and more like a desperate attempt to dismantle a person. The crowd didn't cheer. They let out a collective horrified gasp as the sound of impact echoed through the silent arena. This was violence stripped of its theatrics, ugly and uncomfortable to watch. She didn't use her signature moonsault. She didn't climb the turnbuckles to showcase her agility. Instead, she trapped the champion's arm in a joint lock that looked medically dangerous, applying torque with a cold mechanical precision. The champion tapped out almost immediately, slapping the mat in panic, but Iyo didn't let go. The referee pulled at her shoulders, shouting commands that were ignored. Security finally rushed the ring, a swarm of yellow shirts flooding the canvas. But even then, Iyo didn't struggle or fight them. She simply released the hold when she decided it was finished, standing up amidst the chaos with that same blank expression. She looked down at the writhing champion, not with pride, but with the clinical detachment of a surgeon who had just excised a tumor. The crowd was stunned into silence, the usual chants of let them fight dying in their throats because this hadn't looked like a fight. It looked like an assault. As she exited the ring, pushing past the security team without looking back, the camera caught a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, crushing sadness, a burden of duty that made the violence feel tragic rather than triumphant. The ripple effect. Backstage, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Camera, usually steady and cinematic, shook slightly as the operator followed Iyo through the curtain and into the gorilla position. The production area, typically a hub of shouting directors and moving parts, was dead silent. Executives stood with their arms crossed, faces pale, unsure if they should congratulate her or call the police. The roster, usually watching the monitors with professional interest, parted like the Red Sea as she walked down the hallway. There were no handshakes, no hugs, no welcome-back pleasantries. The younger talent looked at her with fear, while the veterans watched with a mixture of concern and suspicion. This wasn't the camaraderie of the locker room. It was the isolation of a dangerous outsider. Reports began flooding social media instantly, but the tone was all wrong. The trending topics weren't celebrating a return. They were asking if everything was okay. The blurred lines had caused a fracture in the narrative, leaving the audience unable to distinguish between the show and the mental state of the performer. The fallout was immediate and messy. Interviewers standing by for post-show comments lowered their microphones as she passed, sensing that asking a question would be a mistake. Iyo didn't go to a dressing room. She walked straight toward the exit of the arena, her gear still taped, her breathing finally starting to heavy as the adrenaline faded. The narrative hook wasn't about who she would face next or what title she wanted. The hook was the instability she represented. In a world of controlled chaos, she was a variable that the machine couldn't account for. The commentary team, still live on the post-show stream, struggled to find the words to sign off. They couldn't pivot to a highlight reel or a plug for the next pay-per-view. They were forced to sit in the discomfort of what they had just witnessed, analyzing the footage of the champion being helped to the back by medical staff. The story had shifted from who is the best wrestler to what happened to Iyo Sky during those 2 years, and why has she come back to hurt us? The cost of brilliance. The broadcast finally cut to black, leaving millions of viewers staring at their own reflections in dark screens, the silence of their living rooms mirroring the silence of the arena. This wasn't just a shock return designed to spike ratings for a quarter. It was a deconstruction of the very idea of the returning hero. In 2026, the audience had been trained to expect fireworks and nostalgia. Instead, they received a mirror reflecting the brutal toll of the industry. Iyo Sky's return wasn't about reclaiming a spot on the roster. It was a manifestation of unresolved history. A ghost coming back to haunt the house she helped build. The unsettling nature of the segment forced the audience to confront the reality that characters are people. And sometimes time away doesn't heal wounds, it infects them. The intensity of the night didn't come from the moves performed, but from the unspoken implication that something was fundamentally broken in the heart of the competitor. As the days would pass, and the clips would be dissected frame by frame, the conversation would shift away from the shock of the moment to the tragedy of the context. The genius of the Sky had not returned to fly. She had returned to drag everyone else down to the ground with her. The lingering question that stayed with every viewer wasn't about storylines or championship belts. It was a far more uncomfortable inquiry into the nature of sacrifice. We demanded she come back. We tweeted, we posted, we fantasy-booked her return for years. And now that she was here, looking hollowed out and dangerous, the audience had to ask themselves the one question they were afraid to answer. We wanted Iyo Sky back, but were we willing to pay the price for what she had become? The screen remained dark, the story unresolved, leaving a pit in the stomach of the wrestling world that no amount of entertainment could fill.